This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Thank you again for listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. My guest today is Noelle Mering, and we're going to talk about her new book, Awake, Not Woke, A Christian Response to the Cult of Progressive Ideology. So Noelle analyzes a number of characteristics about the contemporary social justice movement. She also outlines the intellectual history, how this movement came about, from Hegel and Marx to the Frankfurt School thinkers like Adorno and Marcuse, and contemporary thinkers, and also the sexual revolution, how it connects to progressive social justice. We also discuss some of the deep incoherence and how some of these ideas have actually exacerbated harm and injustice towards the weak. Noelle has a chapter on victims and contagion and the work of Rene Girard, so we discuss that as well. And at the end, she offers a personalist response. So Noelle does not deny that there are real injustices in the world and that these need to be addressed. But she argues that the contemporary social justice movement is precisely the wrong way to address the problems of injustice and has often made them worse. So instead, she offers a personalist alternative about how to think about justice and address injustice. So her book is now available for pre-order, and I put a link to that and other things we discuss at themoralimagination.com. Thanks to all those who've written reviews. If you have not written a review, please do so if you like the podcast. The best place to do it is at Apple Podcasts. So even if you listen somewhere else, I think you can still review it at Apple because other places don't have reviews. That really helps grow the podcast. Thanks also to those who've supported on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show, you can find the link to Patreon at themoralimagination.com website. So thanks again for listening. Don't hesitate to write with suggestions and ideas. And I hope you enjoy my podcast with Noelle Mering on Awake, Not Woke, and a personalist alternative to thinking about social justice. So Noelle, thank you very much for joining the Moral Imagination Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So it's very nice to talk to you. Noelle and I, we actually studied in graduate school 20 years ago. And I actually served Mass at your wedding. I don't know if you remember that, but 20 years ago. And so it's really good to catch up. We've been able to talk a little bit lately. And I'm really delighted to talk to you about your new book. I had a podcast earlier with your co-author, Carrie Gress.
Yep.
All three of us, we studied together. And you've written Theology of Home, Volume 1 and 2. But this is a new book that you have. It's really a philosophical book and a social analysis book. And it's called Awake, Not Woke. And it's kind of a critical analysis, a desire to understand how you articulate like a woke culture and all the kind of things around what that means. So what I'm hoping to do is have a discussion about exactly what that means and go through your book because I think it was very interesting. And I especially like the intellectual history that you bring to these contemporary social questions.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah, that felt important to include the background.
So let's first of all, why don't we just start with like the big picture of your book? What is the big theme of the book? Why did you feel compelled to write it? And what are you trying to get people to understand as you engage these, some of them very serious social and moral debates of our time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it came about, sort of had been a long time coming. I'd written a couple of articles about the woke movement and how one in particular I wrote for the American Mind and was just trying to tease out why there's sort of a movement that aims for justice oftentimes can end up in practice being rather merciless. And that seemed like an interesting thing to think about. But it was also mostly just a recognition that there was this movement that was quickly and rapidly taking over a lot of our culture. It came with a new vocabulary and new factions of people. It seemed to be, in a way, self-consuming, where you'd have like feminists sort of turning against the transgender movement, but they're supposed to be aligned, and I was really trying to understand what were the animating principles that was sort of uniting and forwarding this ideology. And it kind of personally came to a bit of a head when my alma mater for undergrad, which is a private liberal arts evangelical school, they started having a series of protests on campus about the old chapel on the campus had a depiction of Jesus with white skin. And somehow it became a lightning rod. And they started, the students at this wealthy, this private college, which I love, I care about a lot, the institution a lot, staged protests with tape over their mouths and the word resist on their forehead. And, And I think it's a sympathetic that, it probably is not always great. You won't have depictions of Christ with, we have Mary who looks Asian in Asian countries and depicted in different ways for the sake of the culture, for certain. But the reaction to this perceived injustice seemed so out of proportion to what was happening, and the school was well-meaning. It wasn't a malignant force anyway. And so I just started reading articles and op-eds that they were writing internally and seeing this happen at other colleges too. And it just really felt like this is not good for the students. The students are there to learn and to study truth and to have debates and to be consumed with sort of grievances that seemed really out of proportion with what was happening. It seemed like a harm to them and a real short-circuiting of their education in general. Anyway, so that sort of spurred me to kind of really pull it together and put up a proposal to TAN. So I emailed my editor and from Theology of Home and just wrote out my proposal, and he emailed back right away and said, let's do it. So then I got writing.
Good. Well, it's a serious book. It's popular and engaging, but it's a serious book and a wide-ranging book because you go through a lot of different things. I mean, you're talking about, the sexual revolution, you're talking about education, intellectual history, as we've discussed. So before we go into maybe some of the details of the book and some of you breaking down what you see this kind of contemporary ideology is, let's actually pause for a second and maybe try to articulate what this is. So like we've already in this short conversation, we've kind of talked about this ideology, this existing ideology. And I think part of your book is an attempt to break it down, to articulate what it is. And you use the term woke. And I think woke is an interesting, there's a couple of different versions of woke, right? There's maybe a history of the term woke, meaning you're awakened, your consciousness has been awakened. You have kind of like woke capitalism, you have woke with questions of race, woke with questions of gender and sexuality. But let's maybe pause for a second and try to articulate the best we can. Woke is a shortcut. It's a synonym for something. And I know that's actually part of what your whole book is doing. But maybe just for listeners, what's the maybe essence of the critique or the ideology that gets at this point labeled as woke? And which will be interesting because, I don't know, a year from now, if there's a listener listening to this podcast, which I hope there is, that maybe the phrase won't be as clear of what it is right now at the end of 2020. So let's try to first do that. Maybe that's a bit of a difficult question, but let's try to do that first.
Sure. Distill what I mean by the word woke, in other words, or what the term movement means.
Right. And in fairness to you and to the listeners, that's actually part of what our discussion is going to be, right? So that you go through a number of chapters going through the intellectual history. And one thing I like about the intellectual history part of it is that these ideas, okay, woke is kind of popular right now. This is the movement of 2019, 2020, 2021 for certain as we go into that next year. But these ideas aren't brand new. That I used to teach undergraduate philosophy, and I used to tell the students, you may never have heard of Nietzsche, but he's heard of you.
That's great. Yeah.
Right. Meaning that we are shaped by intellectual forces, right? John Maynard Keynes says, how often are people shaped by the scribbling of some economist, a now defunct economist, right? So there are intellectual forces that are shaping. Now they come to this kind of amalgamation right now in what you're calling woke. And so I know part of our whole discussion is to kind of break that down and go through that. But maybe just as a starting point, like for the listener, what do you mean by woke? And then part of your whole book is this is an alternative, that we have to be awake, right? Not woke.
Right. No, that's right. So I think by using the term, I define it early on in the book, just that it's a state of being alert and attuned to the layers of pervasive oppression in society. It originated with regard to racism, but it's since then broadened to include all areas of social oppression. And those are commonly understood to be along the lines of gender, race, sexuality, all the hot button stuff. But fundamentally, it's an ideology that roots all of human interaction hinging on power. And in order to write the power structure of dominance. So that's an easy segue into the intellectual history, which can be pinned in. It's such a big conversation. The Enlightenment plays into it. I don't really get too much into that, but I sort of started with Karl Marx, who was influenced largely by Hegel, and Hegel, is notoriously complex, but I think the main ideas that Marx was an evangelist for was this notion of history as being this state of progressing towards a more perfect state through what he called the dialectic. And the dialectic was the recognition that we have internal conflicts in society, that there will be a status quo, which he called the thesis, and then the forces that are the conflicting elements will kind of turn against each other, and then there'll be sort of a revolutionary moment, that's the antithesis, and then the synthesis, which is what comes next. And then that synthesis becomes the new thesis, and then this process of sort of revolutionizing society forward, eventually, in theory, would reach this perfect state.
And Marx is really the key figure, right? So I think it's wise that you start with Hegel because it contextualizes him. But really, it's kind of funny, isn't it? Because you think the key figure in 2020 in what you're calling the woke movement, this ideological justice, social justice movements, is actually Karl Marx,
right,
who was the key figure in the 20th century.
Yep. And he just like a whack-a-mole, he just keeps popping back up. It's a cycle of Marxian thought being reformulated and reinstituted time and again. And I think we don't always recognize it as such. But yeah, when you tease into the root of something, oftentimes that is kind of behind the door. So in Hegel, he really found the groundwork to justify and advance this sort of a ideology of revolutionary transformation. He seized on the dialectic, but he was a brutal materialist. He didn't even argue for materialism. He just thought it was obvious. He had this understanding that all of society are divided into the haves and the have-nots, the bourgeois and the proletariat, and that these were mutually unbeneficial setup. Obviously for the working class, you can see where he thought that they were, they had a miserable life, they were had no autonomy. But he also saw that if this was a bad setup for the ruling class, that they, in a way, needed the working class in order to maintain this illusion of their own, superiority. And so he took the dialectic and really wanted the effort of revolution to be promulgated through helping the working class realize the misery of their lives. So that's why he famously called religion the opiate of the masses, because religion sort of teaches you what to do with your suffering and how to find meaning in it. And it kind of, according to Marx, lulls you into sort of a complacency of not rebelling against your suffering. So this is the first seeds of what we see in the woke movement, which is raising your consciousness or becoming awakened to the misery of your situation, the injustice of the disparity between the haves and the have-nots, and then becoming an activist against it in order to right these wrongs. Mm-hmm. Eventually working towards that perfect state, sort of similar to Hegel, but this would be an economic perfection.
Okay, so for Marx, I interviewed Carlo Lancialotti, who's the translator of Augusto Del Noce, mm-hmm. Who also and Del Noce kind of makes this point that Marxism transformed from an economic to sexual liberation and mm-hmm. to other things. Mm-hmm. And so in your book, so you first kind of give the overview of Marx and Hegel and where he goes, but then it really gets to kind of the core of the contemporary Marxian view, which you find in what's often called the Frankfurt School, right? So Adorno and Marcuse and other thinkers, but also with Italian Antonio Gramsci and all. Maybe could you go through a little bit of some of the, say, intellectual genealogy of this? Well, actually, you know what? I've changed my mind. Okay, I probably shouldn't do this in the middle of a podcast, but I did. I changed my mind. You know what? I think, why don't we pause for a second? And before we go more into the intellectual history, I still think it would be helpful for me and for listeners, for you to articulate what are some of the dominant features. And you go through these kind of three main characteristics, like, group over person, et cetera. Why don't we start there and we go through those chapters where you kind of articulate what this social justice movement, this woke movement actually looks like. And then we'll circle back and we'll go to try to find the intellectual history of it. I think maybe that's a better idea. What do you think?
That sounds great.
Okay,
so I was trying to understand what are the animating principles of the movement, and I distilled it down to three primary distortions, the three binaries, and each one thing is emphasized to the detriment of the other. So the first one is the emphasis of the group over the person, and then I can go through these in more detail. Mm-hmm. And the second one is the emphasis on will over reason or nature, and the third is an emphasis on power, human power over right authority. And then this is the section of the book that's about the main dogmas. And then there's a fourth that's not a distortion, but it is a look at the crowd and innocence, which we can get into later. But those three are the main animating distortions, I think, that are key to understanding woke movement. So the first one is emphasis of group over the person. And obviously persons need to be part of a group. We are not supposed to be, just individualists without any belonging. There's a very natural human desire to belong. But there are different types of groups. Like a healthy group would be most encapsulated by the human family, right? In its healthy form. That the family is the place where the good of the individuals, the same as the good of the family, the person is known, understood, there's an intimacy, and it's a type of intimacy that's both awful and challenging. It's challenging because you are forced to see your faults, you're forced to see yourself truly as you are when someone really knows you, but you're also able to contend with your faults and you're able to grow. But for group identity in the woke movement, there was a real effort, and this gets back to the intellectual history, to work against the family, that the family is actually a stumbling block for the sake of revolution. So your group identity, your belonging instead comes from being sort of a totem or an instantiation of a movement of whatever your oppressed group is. So that's where we get identity politics. The problem is that it's a group membership that really diminishes the person rather than allows the person to flourish, because they are both reduced and sort of absorbed into this political movement where the ideology is emphasized over the person. So this is why we have this odd phenomenon of, for example, a conservative Black man won't be given a platform, in this movement. He won't be allowed to represent his group because it's not ultimately about his membership in the group. It's about his membership in the group plus his adherence and activism for the sake of the ideology. So, that's one specific way, but that was really striking to me to put that together. And women, I as a woman, I experienced this as well. I'm a pro-life woman. I tend to be conservative, and it feels like I wouldn't have a voice or a platform, that I wouldn't, were I supportive of the right to abortion and all these other things that are sort of the more in line with the feminist ideology.
Sorry, it went up. So you're saying, as you're a married woman, also a mother of 6 and pro-life. And so you'd say, you wouldn't feel like, or you would not be given a place to speak about the role of women because you don't hold to the kind of platform of the ideology.
Yeah, and we saw that pretty clearly in the Women's March in 2017, I think it was, when a group of pro-life feminists wanted to march with them. And they were first allowed to be on the official website and banner, but then they had to be removed because they said, you can walk, in the march, but you cannot have any official connection to this women's march, which made it really seem like, well, they're women. But the problem was that it's not enough to be a woman. They didn't embrace the ideology. And therefore, if the core of your personhood is built around oppression, to not be striving to combat that oppression is to, in some way, not be fully living your life as a woman. If you're defined by oppression. And that's one of the key differences that I think that this shift from, I'm a Catholic, I was writing this from a Catholic perspective, a Christian perspective. And I realized, I think in this group person chapter is where I flesh it out, that the Orthodox Christian understanding of the human person is defined in relationship to the love of God. The woke definition of the human person is defined by the evil of society in relationship to the evil of society, either as a perpetrator or as a victim of it. And that definition is utterly, it might seem like a small esoteric point, but it actually totally transforms the way you interact with the world, the way you see yourself, and also the way you can define the goodness of a human being. So if you are not working against the oppression, that you're not acknowledging the very core of your humanity, the very core of your personhood. So by me being pro-life, or these pro-life feminists saying that they're pro-life, they are in denial of something that makes them women. And so they're less than, according to the ideology. And so it really winds up not becoming a women's march so much as, an abortion march. But I accept that it is a women's march according to that definition of women being defined by oppression. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, no, I think so. So it's helpful because I think it's also, as you talk about it, it is in a sense dialectic. So I was thinking maybe we should have waited to go to Marx, but maybe it's helpful because it is in a sense, it's a Hegelian Marxian dialectic, because as I'm taking notes, I'm imagining, so you have these group over person, will over reason, power over authority, and the crowd and the victim. But you have in one sense, these dogmas,
mm-hmm.
But actually there's it's like a 2-part dialectic. So it's not simply the group over the person, it's the group over the person is part of the ideology, but you have to hold certain principles that make you in the group. right? And I think, so see what I'm saying? Maybe that wasn't very clear, but it's almost like I'm seeing it. I wish I could draw it out, because it's both the group over the person. If you hold to certain positions, then you're welcome. And I think, so it's like, there's both these distortions, and then there's these key ideas, which hopefully as we continue to discuss, we'll start to bring out. And the other thing is, maybe to clarify, so that part of a key element, which you already said, is that there's oppression taking place. And in a sense, everyone's in a master-slave relationship, to use Hegelian language, right? Everybody's in a master-slave. Everybody's either bourgeoisie or the proletariat. Everybody's either the oppressed or the oppressor. And that's where you are. And this is partially a question. And that identifies who you are. So in society, and I think this is what you were saying, that say in a Catholic understanding, you're created in the image of God. And while you have a social nature in the family, you are, in a sense, defined by the fact that you are a child of God, willed for his or her own sake. Right. And then you have all these attachments. So you're in this family, in this culture, in this country, in this place. But in the kind of social justice woke ideology that you're analyzing, you are simply either the oppressed or the oppressor. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. And just to flesh out your distinction, you're saying that it's not enough to be a member of the group. Nicole Hannah-Jones, the main author of the 1619 Project, she had a quote some time ago, a few months ago, that she said, we all know there's a difference between being politically Black and being racially Black. So they do make that distinction. They make the same distinction with being gay or queer, that there's a political version of gay, and then there's just being a homosexual, and so the activism really becomes the key thing, just to flesh out what you were saying too. I thought that was a great point. Yeah, that there is a further distinction has to be made.
Interesting. Okay, so that's the group over the person. Is there anything else in that area of group over the person you think that's really essential?
Well, I think it's one of the things that I found fascinating is that there's a real injustice that ends up happening in this situation, and we saw this went viral. Smithsonian Museum had a chart, and there's been some other examples of this where they are starting to define groups of people in a way that is making them, the people that they want to empower, they end up making defined as being less. So that, like the Smithsonian chart, they were saying that part of whiteness is being on time, hard work, responsibility, all these things that are universal human virtues, they're trying to say are actually, oppressive white virtues. And that should not, we have to stop holding people to that standard because it was actually a form of racism. So in other words, it's this kind of really twisted example of how the ideology really harms the exact people it's trying to help, and ends up in the effort for, looking for justice, ends up really treating them unjustly and also weakening them. There's this study I went into about victim culture. These sociologists went into these. I don't believe that this was just a sociological effort. I don't think they had a religious point or anything like that, but they go through 3 different types of culture: honor culture, victim culture, and dignity culture, and how we're sort of on the cusp of the transition from dignity culture into victim culture, where really, we wind up scanning our environment for ways in which we are aggrieved, because that's sort of how you achieve respect, is through being harmed. And so it kind of creates this perverse incentive to find ways in which people are treating you badly, or that's why we get microaggressions. In a way, there's a supply and demand problem. We've never before given such moral stature to being oppressed as we do now. At the same time, we've had blessedly fewer instances of acts of injustice in the way that we did in the not so distant past. We have a horrible, history with slavery and racism and
Jim Crow and all those things.
Yeah. But so it's impossible to say we haven't really progressed since then. But they can't really say that because there has to be a broadening of grievances. If there's not enough in supply, there's a real demand for them. And so that's why we get microaggressions, all these things. Anyway, so I fleshed out some of that stuff in that chapter too.
Yeah, well, I think 3 things, actually. One, just a quick one. I think, in one sense, we've progressed, right? In another sense, we haven't. Because, and I think this is an Alexander Solzhenitsyn and kind of a theme that Benedict XVI, right? That our technological progress is not necessarily a moral progress. And so in one sense, we're still the same people surrounded by in our own, sin.
Mm-hmm.
But also there is, we don't have Jim Crow,
Mm-hmm.
and that's progression. But we also do have, say, abortion,
Mm-hmm.
and we have pornography,
Mm-hmm.
and we have, I did an interview with Oyebaniju Akocha, we have on kind of the neo-colonialism in the developing world, right, which has racist undertones to that as well. So I mean, but what's very interesting is like, because you pointed out, I mean, you know this, my listeners know this, I'm pro-life. And so, but that doesn't matter, right? Okay, that part's okay because it doesn't fit the ideology. So that's, I think, an interesting question of what progression looks like. But there's two other things that are actually stood out to me. One is, I remember when I read this and you were talking about this honor culture, victim culture, and dignity. And I thought it was interesting because you said, and correct me if I misrepresent you, but so you have an honor culture, which is an ancient, you see this in Japan, you see this in Rome, you see this in duels, you see it in the West, all the Wild West, you see it, it manifests in a lot of different places. So you have this honor culture. And in a sense, when honor culture begins to disintegrate, people are immediately looking for offenses and to go into duel to solve the offense. Mm-hmm. And then that gets replaced in the West by dignity culture. And actually I once gave a lecture on kind of the genealogy of dignity, which I won't go into now, don't worry. But it's interesting to watch like even how the idea of dignity changes. But the sense that each person is created in the image of God, and so they have value as a person. And again, that doesn't mean everybody's treated correctly, because we also have Christian nations that are engaging in the moral evil of slavery, right? So, right, we're talking a bit bigger than simply saying, oh, everybody was treated well. That's where we know that's not the case. Right. It's something I brought up in another podcast, but I think it's worth now. Like Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, when he analyzes the Enlightenment, I mean, he says, here's some good things, here's the bad things. He said some of the reasons for the Enlightenment are a reaction to Christianity's failure to live up to its principles. Mm. And I think this is also what we can also see, I think, with parts of the woke movement, right? Parts of intersectionality, parts of this concern for justice. There's a failure to live up to some of our standards. And so that's, I think, we have to keep that in mind, which I know you do. So you have the honor culture, then you have dignity culture, then you have the victim culture. And one of the things that you said that struck me was, in the victim culture and the honor culture, offenses are taken seriously. Mm-hmm. Right. And it also seems to, which hopefully we can talk about later, but that this idea of forgiveness or repentance is not enough, right? It must be, satisfaction must be had, whether it's a duel or, say, a cancellation, if you want to talk the modern language of cancel culture, right? It's harder, in a sense, to repent, right, in a victim culture or have moral growth in a victim culture or honor culture. Did I misunderstand that, or do you want to explain that or correct that?
Right. And I think the reason why they both are similar in that way is because they both are seeking their value from something outside themselves in the community. So the person's honor, and in honor culture, if their name is slandered or, these are extremely grave offenses. And then same in a victim culture, you're scanning your environment to see how you're being treated with the understanding that you get your value and your power ultimately from the community. Whereas a dignity culture, it idealizes sort of striving to turn a blind eye or turn the other cheek, would be the more scriptural way to say it. The dignity of the person is, in this culture, we find it in this radical concept of it being in relationship to being a child of God. Radical at the time that the Christian church was introduced to society. And so so if someone harms you or offends you or insults you, you're able to ideally find your worth is still intact. Your dignity is still intact because it's not reliant on that other person.
All right. So that's interesting. So what the honor culture and the victim culture do is, because the dignity is attached to the group, which is part of the group versus person. Yeah. The dignity is external, not interior.
Right. It's your standing in society. Okay. Yeah.
The other thing that was interesting about, you talked about that Smithsonian element, which I think we could talk about a lot of things around that, but it just made me think of this as you were talking about. I mean, one is how, and you write about this, it uses some of the language of kind of the white racist, right? The eugenicist, the person who thinks the kind of the colonial attitude of like, well, people of color just don't have the gifts that, white people have, right? This kind of idea. And it's if you look at, say, racist language, and then you look at some of the woke language of the group that you bring out, they're similar, which is, I think, one thing. I remember I had the chance to visit Rwanda when I was doing this film, Poverty Inc. And what would happen is I heard that Paul Kagame, who was the president, who is still the president, but at the time was the president, people would come to Kigali and they'd say, "Oh, it's so clean." And he would always say, "Why does that surprise you? Do you think African cities can't be clean?" And I mean, of course, he would do that on purpose to make you uncomfortable. Right. But the point is like, well, what are you implying? Right. And I think, so there's this one sense, but I think actually, and this is why we'll go into it later, but this is actually why I think one of the reasons I think your book is important is because we have to go into the intellectual sources. Otherwise, next thing you know, you find yourself holding these views, but if you don't know the intellectual pedigree, you end up holding these views that are fundamentally opposed to what you think. I mean, I doubt that the Smithsonian organizers like actually want to hold that, I don't know, working hard and producing great products is somehow like a white thing. I think that they don't want to hold that. But what happens is you get kind of taken into this ideology. Next thing you know, you're holding these positions that you don't actually even believe. And that's why I think we have to go back and say, well, where did they come from? Which we'll do. But that just struck me as another example of just why the pedigree and why the intellectual history or the genealogy of these ideas actually matters. It's not simply pedantic. Right. It actually explains, because it's rooted in some view of the person, right? So, but let's move. We'll go back to that, because let's move that you've got person over group, and then your next one is what's the second one?
Will over reason or nature.
Will over reason. Yeah. Okay. Why don't we go to that one then?
Okay. Yeah. So the main thrust of this chapter is, I think it's best understood thinking about it in this great term that I try to flesh out called the therapeutic self. And this was kind of
brief.
In the Frankfurt School, they were really uniting a neo-Marxism with neo-Freudianism. So this was based on principles from Freud. And it relies on three sort of values, which are individuality, authenticity, and liberation. And how you kind of examine that is that in the same way that we can be oppressed by our state in life, we can also internalize a sort of oppression, which becomes a type of repression, where we are sort of trying to conform ourselves to these constructed moral norms. But in actuality, we have deep down an individualism, and that most, in typical Freud speak, was mostly unique based on it being a sexual drive towards, that in a state of nature, we have sexual drives towards diverse objects. And that the process of growing up is sort of a process of learning to repress all these drives. And so for the therapeutic self to become liberated, it's a matter of identifying the non-conforming sexual drives that are in you, being willing to express them. And the more out of ordinary they are, the higher degree of freedom you've achieved. And so this is why, you see at pride parade, there's sort of it's sort of this competition almost to be more bizarre. I don't know if you've ever been to one. I stumbled into one in Paris once, and also one in San Francisco. And I have friends who are, very much supporters of the movement. And so, I have deep, compassion for people who are caught up in this. But there is this effort to express yourself for more and more uniquely, in a way more and more perversely, ultimately, because there is that is ultimately what the freedom and the liberation of the human being is. So what happens is that it's this finding your will. Carter Snead has a great book that's out about this now, that this sort of idea that our bodies are just instruments to our real selves, which is our will. And everyone has desires that they want, projects they want to engage in life, things they want to achieve. And our bodies are sort of something that we can instrumentalize.
Used to that end. Yeah. It's like I always say, it's the image that we're driving around in our bodies like we drive around in a car.
Right.
That's the image, which is, I think, clearly, to be clear, that's an error. I mean, in so many ways, which we could talk about, but right, that's the image. It's like you have a car that you use to accomplish certain things. Well, you have a body that that's somehow distinct from your person.
Right. And ultimately your body becomes, meaningless, right? Because that's why we end up with Gnosticism, and the transgender movement is the encapsulation of it in a lot of ways. But yeah, so
there's also, by the way, which we don't have to talk about, but it is actually important. It actually also, you brought the Gnostic up, that's why I bring it up. There's a Manichaean element to this, which is actually, I think, important. So at least I'll just introduce it. But that it's a rejection of the affirmation of the goodness of matter and the goodness of being.
Yeah.
That's actually part of the problem. And so, which I probably should do a whole series. Maybe you can come back and we can actually go through this real question. But that, say, in a Catholic understanding, a Jewish Catholic understanding, right? Creation is good. The body is good. The body's not an accident.
Mm-hmm.
The body's not something you need to escape from, right? And so we're ensouled organisms, right? So St. Thomas Aquinas says that death is the most unnatural thing. He says, I am not my soul, right? Because we're embodied persons. We're ensouled organisms. And I think, so this is, again, part of, the pedigree element. There's a lot of things going on. One of them is the failure to affirm the goodness of our bodies and the goodness of matter. Yeah. That's the Gnostic element. I just wanted, you said it, you put that, I just wanted to throw it out there, but please keep going, because you have this, you have this rejection of, our bodies, you said, become meaningless. That's when I interrupted you.
Yeah, and it sets us up for a lot of misery, right? Because we all know very plainly in our experience that our bodies are integral to ourselves. We might not have St. Thomas's understanding the composite of body and soul, but we intuit this in a way, right, that is unmistakable. If someone does something to my body, they do it to me.
Right.
And you know that as soon as you have an experience of something, this is like, in so many ways, explains the complete frustration for women that they're of a lack of dearth of good men, and a feeling of being used, because their things are being done to their bodies that are supposed to be casual and meaningless because of the sexual revolution.
But they're not.
And no woman actually experiences it in that way, unless she's so deeply callous and deeply wounded that she's utterly had to erect this hard shell around her to keep herself from being able to experience the hurt feelings that are, bubbling up in her soul. So, but most women, they don't have that. They are living a life that they think they're supposed to live, but these things that are happening, they're doing with their bodies are bonding them with people, and they're feeling hurt because of it. And this is it's such a pathology of society now, and it's sort of a truism that women are more miserable than they were before. And that's a broad statement, and it's not true in every case, obviously, but the statistics of depression and, all these things are really on the rise. That's a multivariate causes for that. But certainly, certainly in my anecdotal interactions with women and dear friends of mine and who I've walked through life with, there are these pathologies of hurt and not understanding why they're feeling hurt. And, it's this whole sort of cycle. So, that's just a sort of to flesh out why the body is so important, because it helps us to understand how to live.
Right. Well, and I think, so one is, you said like there's a bonding that's going on, which is biological, right? It's actually hormonal, neurobiological, chemical, and psychological. There's like even the biology of sexual relations proves the lie that it's somehow casual, right? The bonding attachment. But you actually developed this a little bit. Maybe you could go into this a bit more, because I think it's important, especially from a woman's perspective, to talk about. You said it's kind of misery, and you give some examples of like I think in the book you talk about Sex and the City and Girls, the TV show Girls. I've not seen either of them, but that you kind of go through them, and then there's a glamour element. Mm-hmm. And then there's the reality element. And your co-author, Carrie Gress, talks about this actually in the podcast, I think, when I talked about the Cosmopolitan magazine, like they would just write stories that weren't true, right? And so you have this kind of glamour TV view, and then you have the reality of what actual women are going through. Could you develop that a little bit?
Sure. Well, part of in the historical genealogy that I touch upon is that part of the architects of the sexual revolution from the Frankfurt School really understood movies and television to be a powerful instrument in bringing about change in the culture by helping us to think differently about how we ought to live and what our power looks like. So, I think Sex and the City, well, maybe even in shows like Friends, these were charming, whimsical shows, sort of painted this fantasy, without moral consequence. And Girls kind of took it to a more nihilistic perspective. It just, and I think it was necessary, because Sex and the City was portraying this wonderful lifestyle with some things that would go wrong, but really ultimately this is going to be a beautiful, powerful life. And I remember just the phenomenon of seeing so many women identifying with the show, and they would say, I'm this character, I'm that character. They would dress up and go drink the drinks that those women got and go to the movie premiere together. But the actually living that experience, you can't help but see that there's a chasm between what's portrayed and what you've been sold, what you've taken home from that in that lifestyle. And there's a moral hangover, and there's literal hangovers, and there's a comeuppance that comes with that type of life that is really breaking women, can really break women down, and men too. I don't think they're advantaged by this lifestyle either, because they're not achieving families, they're not achieving a deeper purpose than career or fulfilling your gratification of their desires, and these are not recipes for happiness in any way. So what Girls did is it took that chasm, and it said, well, let's lean into this. Yeah, you're actually miserable, but you know what? That's actually part of it too. And in some way, because those women, I think, I didn't watch the show broadly, but I saw enough of it to see that they were really showing a lot more of the ugliness of this life. And still, but still it's compelling. It's the only road you have. It's your only option, because this is the avenue to power, to recognizing where your oppression lies and fighting against that. So yeah, so that's in the Sexual Revolution chapter, which is in the Indoctrination section of the book. But it really ties into the second distortion of will over reason, right? And then you see it kind of comes back to that first distortion of that we were talking about, the injustice, is that the exact people the movement ostensibly is trying to help, because there are real injustices that are done to women, and women experience wounds, they experience abuse. And so this is an ideology that says, well, you have been truly hurt. And yeah, women have been. So here's a possible way out of it. You've been, dominated, and you need to achieve your dominance now. You need to reverse this structure. And it sets them on a course of seeking power as their purpose. Whereas, women are actually powerful, but power is not our goal. Our goal is the same goal as men. We want love. We want real love that involves sacrifice and entails commitment and entails duties and vulnerability and care and all these things that they're not implied by a goal of power.
Or liberation.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and that's a funny thing too, is that so much of it is kind of mirroring, it's walking closely enough to the truth, but is far enough that it kind of mirrors the truth. And so it's like a sort of a half lie, where it entices you with the feeling of truth, but without the actual real cure, the real solution. We think we want to be liberated. What we really want is freedom. We want real freedom, interior freedom. We want the freedom of, Solzhenitsyn, who can be in jail, and, or Cardinal Van Thuan, these people who could be imprisoned and have everything externally stripped from them and still have an interior freedom. And that is the actually most powerful way to live, not the circumstantial liberation,
Yeah, that's actually, the example of, like, say, Frankel or Solzhenitsyn or Cardinal Van Thuan. I had a colleague who actually worked with Cardinal Van Thuan.
Wow.
He was just amazing. In a Vietnamese prison for 10 years. And I think
he was in solitary for 9, I think, in prison for 13 or something like that.
13 or something. Yeah. He was in solitary for 9. Yeah. And, I don't know if I heard that they had the guards, would watch him. And finally, he would convert the guards.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they finally were like, okay, finally, you can just have Catholic guards, because they just gave up. I mean, like, he would convert the guards. And the book, he has a series of talks on hope. So I think so. I think the liberation thing, Benedict XVI and Truth and Tolerance and some other places, actually it's Joseph Ratzinger, it's before he's Pope. He writes about this idea of radical liberation of the will. And, which I think is, and again, this is why this movement that you're addressing, which is the contemporary iteration of what's going on, has myriad influences. And I think that's why, we have to continue to break these out. But I think your book does a real service in explaining them. Like, so he has this idea, like, an irrational will is not a free will. Right. And so, like, the example I always give is, if I bang my head on the edge of a table, no one looks at me and think, wow, he's free. Wow. Right. Right. Because it's like, he's crazy, right? Because he says it, and he said it's a diabolical freedom.
Yeah.
So I think that liberation, but I think it's beautiful. What we really want is interior freedom.
Right.
And that's men and women. We want interior freedom. And I think it relates to another. I feel like a papist, because I'm going to give you another papal quote. But that's John Paul II. I remember when I learned this expression he has, that sex outside of marriage, right? Out of a loving, public, permanent commitment is, he said, a lie of the body.
That's so good.
What did you say?
I said that's so good. Such a good quote.
I think so. I think because it may be shocking. Maybe some of the listeners would be like, "What?" But that's okay. It's something to reflect upon. It's a lie of the body because it says, "I am yours, and I take all your hopes and dreams and wants and fears and everything that you have. I give you myself, and I receive you in this mutual self-donative act. But not really. I'm just giving you. It's just my body." And it goes back to this disembodiment problem we have, where the body is instrumentalized. Another section. I'm going to just change direction a little bit here, but another section that I thought was really interesting, or part in this section. So you talk about the individual, the authenticity and liberation. And I think you've touched on it a little bit, but I think that authenticity is a really interesting point because trying to find the page here if I can find it. But you're talking about
too, authenticity. I have a whole section on authenticity. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, you do. You actually, and you come up with twice, right? And you talk about in one section, you say, there's a definition of a type of repression that puts us in the path of pursuing what Marcuse calls the performance principle or the reality principle, right?
Yeah.
And then, according to Marcuse, any choice for the sake of some perceived good that's out of alignment with our experienced desire is a performative sign of our internal repression. Echoing Freud, Marcuse believed this denial of ourselves for the sake of our performance is traumatic transition out of the freedom of childlike pleasure pursuits into repression. Right. And what I think is that's a pretty dominant view. Like this is the kind of the real self and who I really am. Theodore Dalrymple has written a book on like the problems of the real self. I actually just told my wife today, this is funny. I said to my wife, I said, listen, when I'm irritable or difficult or, just kind of a pain or lazy, that's not my real self. My real self is so sweet and precious, right? Willing to help, right? I mean, it's just like, and she didn't buy it at all. But anyway, but I mean, part of it is there's something goofy about that. As Theodore Dalrymple says, we never say, oh, I'm sorry, I was kind, my real self is malicious. And we don't ever think that about ourselves. But anyway, but I think what's actually important here is this idea of authenticity. And again, this is a long discussion, but you touch on it in the book. We can at least touch on it here. That there's a confusion about like your feelings, right? We have lots of different feelings that come up all the time. And, the great spiritual writers, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Evagrius of Pontus, for example, or I think 300s, right? The church fathers write about this, right? That we have a lot of things that have come up. And part of what we need to do is integrate those into, this is how I sometimes explain it. We have to, our freedom is only freedom when it's done in accordance or ordained by reason and oriented to truth. So a free act is not simply the raw exercise of my will, but it's ordained by reason and oriented to truth.
Right.
And then I get this, what you said beautifully, this interior freedom. But the authenticity, and then I can authentically be myself and I can authentically love and all these things. But the authenticity of the Frankfurt School and the Freudian kind of Frankfurt element is that if I have some disordered feeling, want, thought, crazy idea that pops into my head, somehow that's who I am. And so there's two parts that come with that. One is it confuses the fact that of the, say, Aristotelian, Thomistic, classical understanding of from the Jewish and Christian traditions and also the Greeks and the Stoics and the Chinese traditions, that we have to discipline ourselves and we have to practice doing what we want so that we can become who we want to be. And that there is, and you write this, I mean, I'll paraphrase you, but you write this, that it's not performative, it's not dishonest, it's not hypocritical to say, I'm selfish and I want to be generous. I'm lazy and I want to be diligent. And so I'm going to try my best to pretend, I put it in this way, pretend to be diligent. And so that by doing that, I create a habit where I actually then become diligent. Father Robert Sirico, who's the president of the Acton Institute and a colleague, and he's a pastor at Sacred Heart of Jesus in Grand Rapids, where I go. And he actually has a great thing. I've heard this homily a couple of times. It's excellent. And he says, okay, we have to forgive one another. You can't forgive. And people will come, can you forgive? I can't. He says, can you want to forgive? No. How about, can you want to forgive? Can you pray to God that you can want to forgive? I can do that. Okay, that's where you're going to start. Right? That's not hypocritical or dishonest or inauthentic. That's a struggle for the good. And you bring this out, that there's, I think, this deep confusion that if you somehow that's performed, you're a performance artist, right? You're not being authentic, right? Which really seems to be like just a justification for me just being a miserable jerk.
Right. Yeah.
You want to develop that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I think that's just the struggle of virtue, right? Is that I think I use an analogy of the person who quits smoking does at first with a clenched fist and, white knuckling it. And eventually, with discipline, it becomes more an interior. They find what they once found so compelling to be repulsive. But at some point in that process, you could call that person a hypocrite. Maybe they stumble, maybe they are not doing this thing, but they really want to, and so there's this like secret desire for this thing that they're acknowledging publicly as being wrong. But I think ultimately it comes down to where I draw out the connection between the word authenticity and authority, and really is ultimately a rejection of authority in so many different ways. The authority of reality, the authority of an intelligible bodily nature, which has things that are, moral norms attached to it, things that we ought to do, things that we ought not to do. The therapeutic self really relies on there not being that sort of normativity. And that's why you can't evaluate the goodness or the badness of the desire. You just have to follow the desire. So in that sort of contemporary understanding of the word authenticity, it is, as you were saying, just a matter of truly owning your desires and living them out. And what we would call sort of in a Christian tradition to be a sin, instead, the revelation of it and the expression of it is rather a badge of honor. Whereas authenticity, I think, in like a Judeo-Christian understanding of it, would be something more akin to like sincerity, where that we shouldn't be performing our virtue, although we should be doing the good, even when we don't feel like it. But we should be striving to reveal our imperfections to those to whom we ought. So to my spouse, to my confessor, to intimate friends, that there's not a sense of hiding and concealing our struggles, but rather that there's a real need to be known. First and foremost, because we're known by God, and following upon that, because there's a duty to let people who ought to know you really know you. And so in that sense, authenticity is there's a real beauty to it, in the sense of sincerity, that we are not pretending to be something that we're not. But the word really etymologically is connected to the word authority. And I think that is such an interesting thing to tease out. And that's in the third chapter, the third distortions of power over authority, is that once we ultimately relinquish or, kill off any authority in our minds that God has over us, then all of these other things, the intelligibility of the body, duties to one another, all of these things fall by the wayside because they're no longer grounded in this higher authority. And it's really disfavored for the sake of that, what we were talking about before, which is a metric of zero-sum power, in all of society.
Yeah, so let's actually go into that. I want to just make two comments that struck me as you were talking. I mean, one is, and you're quite clear about this, right? So there, in the Gospels, Jesus is very clear at critiquing false outward signs, right? Yep. So, and that we must be interiorly struggle, but that there's a difference between a sincere attempt to do the good and failing and not living up to it, right? But that's authentic. That's sincere and authentic. And so, but what Marcuse and then the Frankfurt School go to is, no, if you have, I'll put it at extremes, but I don't think it's actually, correct me if you think I'm being too creating a straw man, right? Here, but it's almost like whatever feeling comes through, especially if it's a perverted sexual feeling or whatever, that's who you are. Right. And it's inauthentic to live on that. So the problem, of course, is this is what struck me. And again, correct me if I'm misreading this, but it struck me, a great irony just hit me in the whole concept of what you're articulating as the woke ideology and the idea of oppression. It's this. So in part of their underlying idea is this, this rejection of any nature, liberation, right? And so you are your feelings, right? But as I tell my children and myself, you are not your feelings. You are not every thought that you've ever had, right? Like, I mean, you're not, and you're not supposed to act on every thought you've ever had. You know, yes, you want to hit your brother or your sister. You're not going to. You're not allowed to. And you need to control yourself. And that's authentic, right? I mean, can you imagine what my life would be like if I always acted on every strong emotion I had? Well, guess what it would be like? And this is what struck me, the irony. It basically would be about me becoming a tyrant and exercising my dominance over others, which is the irony, right? I mean, so correct me if I'm wrong here, Noelle, but like the whole point is like, okay, we have to make sure that the oppressed groups are not treated badly. And as you said, and I agree with you, women have been treated badly by men. I mean, this is like that. It's a problem. It's right in Genesis. You shall desire your husband and he will lord it over you, right? There's this objectification of women. They've been injured by men and sexually used by men. And of course, pornography and all the other evils that are around, right? We have a real experience, legacy, and still continued in a different manner. But we have people are racist. They treat other people badly because of their ethnicity or their race or their whatever position. Okay, these things are real. Okay, so how do you solve? So in one sense, there's injustice, and what becoming woke is to say, be attentive to the fact that there's injustice. Okay, good. You should be attentive to there's injustice, right? Well, maybe we'll talk about this later, but like, I think it's Kimberly Crenshaw started the intersectionality movement. And you and I have talked about this and you write about it in your book. And she starts out by making this point that there's a Black woman was trying to get a job in like 1960s or something at an auto, I think it was maybe GM, and they didn't hire her. And she said, well, you're discriminating against me. And they said, no, we're not. We hire women. We hire Black people. She goes, yes, but you don't hire Black women. Right. And there's a point, like that's an injustice, right? It's right. So we can talk about this later. So in a sense, like, yeah, now where she goes with intersectionality, I think actually undermines the problem, which is part of this. It's actually connected to this whole thing you're talking about. But in a sense, so I don't want to undermine or what's the word I'm looking for? Like devalue, that's not the right word, but devalue this idea that these things that there is injustice. But you can't solve injustice and tell people, do whatever you feel and whatever you want, because that means the people who are going to be able to do that are people with power.
Right.
Okay. 15-year-old girls do not abuse Jeffrey Epstein.
Right.
Okay. People who have power. Right. And there's this fantastic quote by C.S. Lewis: man's power over nature is always some men's power over other men. And so the irony, and again, correct me if this is just as you were talking, it struck me, right? That if you're just your feelings, you're supposed to engage them, then ultimately you're encouraged to use your power to dominate others for your own sexual or other types of gratification.
Right. Right. No, I think that's the irony, is that the woke theory promises power by stripping their adherents of it, the people who adhere to it, in two ways. First, it denies them a path of moral agency. That's what we were talking about before, that sort of interior freedom to know the good, identify it, and pursue it, which makes us slaves to our desire. And then secondly, by defining the person on an axis of oppression, making oppressors irredeemable and the oppressed powerless against systemic forces that aligned against them. So in two ways, really, it's a neutering of power with the promise of power. And I was thinking when you were talking about you don't want to dismiss the injustice. And I think that's so key because, that it's absolutely true that this is not an argument against the reality of injustice. It's just saying that the reaction to injustice is not enough. It's not enough just to see that it's bad and to do something. And you hear people say that a lot. I always am struck when people say, we have to do something. And I think, well, you have to do the thing that's going to fix it.
Right.
Just mere activity and outrage is not going to resolve anything. We need cures. And like you're saying before, we see this in the Me Too movement when you're talking about the domination. Once we understand the human body as being something we can instrumentalize, it begins with us instrumentalizing ourselves. It ends in instrumentalizing another. And that's what
and the weak,
absolutely. And I think in this chapter, the power and authority chapter really comes down to, a loss of authority in the culture. Anthony Esolen had a great piece, I think in Crisis. Anyway, he was talking about the riots and stuff, and he was saying, it's the most bizarre response to everything that's going on is to think that the problem is an excess of manliness. This is really, I'm not doing his quote justice, but basically, like, we can't look at a nation with rampant fatherlessness and think that the problem is, men being an excess of manhood. It's excess of a distorted understanding of manhood. But really, we have harmed us, instituted so many societal pathologies by neutering the icon of authority in this life, which begins with the father. And I think that sounds in today's society sounds like such a retrograde thing to say, but there is an unavoidable or undeniable, rather, understanding, even as a young child, that the father bears with him some sort of authority that the mother doesn't. And it's not because he's smarter or more capable or more effective in certain ways or more skilled. It's just in his body, first and foremost, the broader shoulders, the commanding presence, the deeper voice. And that's a signifier to us that there is something there, that there is something that's a responsibility that is on their shoulders, that they have to live rightly. And if it is subjected to the authority of something higher, then he can bear the weight of it. And same with women, same with all children. No human being can bear the weight of power as an absolute thing, right? I'm getting to the Lord Acton quote, but
right.
It has
power corrupts.
You can't.
Yeah, absolutely. Power corrupts. Absolutely.
Bear it. You cannot bear the responsibility of power unless you understand it to be accountable power. And so, that's just the same thing we're talking about. Is just that this power run amok without.
Yves Simon has good things on authority and power.
Yeah.
So does Robert Nisbet. Yves Simon. Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead. Power run amok.
I was done. That was it.
So you've got these three kind of distortions: the person, group over person, power over authority. Will over reason, power over authority, and you have the crowd of the victim, which is you have a Girardian element. I want to ask you a question and tell me where you think we should go. So one of the things, because you talk about this later, and I wanted, but it strikes one of the problems that we see. So again, I'm going to put this out, and then you tell me if we want to move to later. But one of the problems we see, also following up on this idea of you being your feelings and this kind of authenticity and liberation, is we're seeing both philosophically, but also written into law, as you discussed with Casey versus Planned Parenthood and other things, and is that we're seeing what I call a new ontology of the person. That it's not simply exercise your will and do what you want, but it's actually moving into a new ontology where you are defined by, your identity is defined by your sexual predilection or how you determine you want to get sexual pleasure. So what I mean by that is this, and I think I've talked about this once before on the podcast, but so just in short, so if you think of like a Thomistic understanding of, you have an essence, you have a nature, and then you have existence, and you have freedom. You have what Wojtyła calls self-determination, and then you there's a self-creation element in Thomas and in Wojtyła, but it's always grounded in a certain understanding of who you are, what kind of thing you are, what kind of person. Not thing is wrong, but what kind of person you are, right? And so the existential, there's Christian existentialists, but the kind of Sartrean existentialist says, no, there's just existence. There's no essence. And then your self-creation is you're making yourself out of this kind of raw existence. Now, of course, I think that's incoherent, but let's just keep with it. So, but what happens is that doesn't give you any ground for identity, because part of, as you've talked about, is there's identity politics. That's the group of the person. And so you need to have an identity. But if there's just raw exercise of the will, there's no identity in LGBTQ. It's just, that's your sexual predilection, right? And so, and I actually think this is a whole other can of worms, but I think it's actually a problem even to call someone, say, a homosexual, right? Or LGBTQ. I mean, there's a person who has homosexual tendencies desires. I know that's not politically correct, but I mean, think about this. Like, for example, I mean, this is partially joking and partially serious, but people say, we're celebrating like LGBTQ farmers or LGBTQ this, cooks. Like, what about promiscuous farmers? Right?
Yeah.
Like, should we have we have the promiscuous farmers, and the promiscuous chef over here. And, no one says that. Right. But that, if that's just if that's how you identify, right? So I think there's a problem because I think it's a reduction of the self to your sexual predilection. Yep. But what happens though, and so you can go and talk about this because you've studied this a lot. It seems to me is that so you have this, in a sense, inverted Thomism, and I've talked about this before, where Sartre's existentialism allows you to do what you want, but it doesn't give you any ground of being or identity. So what you have to do is now say, well, no, actually, there is a kind of essence, and that essence comes from the choice of your will and your sexual predilection. And then when the plastic hardens, right, because it's like a plastic anthropology, that's who you are. Mm-hmm. And then that creates your identity as a person based on this, which of course is being written into law and also has to do with questions of religious liberty and a host of other things we could talk about. But could you talk about this a bit? Can you develop? I asked you if you wanted to go this way, and then I just went this way. So now you're stuck. Okay, so you can't say, "Oh, I don't want to go here anymore." Okay, sorry, but can you talk about this because there's this move then to an identification of the self. It's a new ontology of the person, and you do write about this. Could you develop that out and maybe explain it, or how would you respond to that, or argue with what I said?
Yeah, no, I think that you said it so well. And it's sort of that understanding that, like, when you're talking about, it's maybe we shouldn't call a person homosexual because you're then identifying them too deeply at their core as being similar to, something that they, sexual desire. And
but can I say, sorry, and I actually think, I don't mean that in a mean way. I actually meant that in a
that they're more that they're more.
Yeah, exactly.
That's JP2 quote where he said the problem of pornography is that not that it reveals too much, but that it reveals too little. And I think that's what you're getting at, is that this is a movement that ultimately the mob is kind of the archetype for the movement as a whole, because what does a mob do? It both reduces a person and absorbs them. And that's what happens when you closely identify or you establish your identity in relationship to your oppression, is that you're saying too little about yourself. You're not saying too much. It's sort of like an orphaning of your identity. Your identity is off, and it's orphaned into the world.
And one more thing, which but it's right on this, that I think it's not only like right now we're talking about LGBTQ just because of that was the example with Freud and this like authenticity, but it has to do, I think, ideology broadly. Yeah. And I interviewed Gary Saul Morson on this podcast on Lenin. And, this would happen with the same thing with the Marxist, the communist would lose his or her whole self and be completely identified with the party to where they would actually self-incriminate if it would serve the party. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's not, so I think it's important that I just want to make sure that it's important. That's I think the nature of ideology. Yep. I love that quote. I'd forgotten it. I think it applies. The ideology, you're not just a communist. You're not just a Marxist. You're not just a Republican. You're not just a Democrat. Right. You're much more than that.
Right. And that's why it seems like everything's become political. I was just reading the story about Bon Appetit, and they got in trouble for something, and they said, in part of their apology, they said, well, we all know cooking is political, and I think it sounds like it's this broadening of justice, but actually it's like a reduction of the human experience in general. And when you're, to make the distinction again, between groups, that you see this same trend with like someone like Taylor Swift, and I don't, follow her career very closely, but she's obviously this enormous pop icon. And it seems to me that her whole career is built around breakup songs, right? Some man has done something bad to her, and here she is finding her power by, writing this angry breakup song, and then everyone cheers. But she's totally defined then in reaction to an injustice done to her. That is so short-circuiting of the fullness of the human being. What is what does she think? What is she, what beauty does she find? It's sort of establishing our whole self as being a callus. We get wounded and then we have to become tough, and the wound is never addressed. But now our whole identity is just this walking callus throughout the world, and that's how we're powerful. It's reductive. I think you're absolutely right.
It's interesting. And I think that's the challenge partially of growth and maturity in our lives. And I think this goes partially to what you talk about at the end as your alternative. But each of us as a human person, we're very sensitive or very fragile.
Mm-hmm.
And we can be wounded, and we are wounded. And we are social beings, and we're in need of affirmation, of a group, of a place where we can be ourselves. But in order to be yourself, you kind of have to know who you are.
Yeah.
And in order to know who you are, you have to know what kind of being you are. And I think this is where I think a lot of this comes to anthropology, which is, of course, the theme that both of you and I have been thinking about for a long time. So, but I think your point's really interesting that, Taylor Swift example, like you define yourself through this one experience, and you're much more than that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So anyway, that whole ontology thing, is there anything else that you wanted to say just about like this kind of creating new persons, or maybe we could move on to...
Yeah, let's move on. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe let's just go pretty quickly through the concept of indoctrination, which is your third part. So at least you can kind of give some examples there.
Sure. That sounds great. So in the indoctrination part of the book, I have several chapters. The first one is about the sexual revolution as a means and a mechanism for bringing revolution to the culture. And just briefly, so that I start with this social anthropologist from Oxford in the 1930s. He wrote this massive book called Sex and Culture. His name's J.D. Unwin. And he wasn't a religious man. He just was interested in studying this connection between, if there's a connection between sexual freedom and the flourishing of cultures. So he researched 86 societies and civilizations, and he measured flourishing in terms of art, architecture, agriculture, I think literature, probably science. And the single most influential factor determining how a society flourished was whether or not there was a norm of prenuptial chastity. And that was the most influential factor. The second, and then that combined with an understanding of absolute monogamy was really what would would consistently and overwhelmingly connected to the societal flourishing. And one of the things he discovered in his research was that once those things are abandoned, it takes 3 generations. The first generation sort of kind of on the fringes. The second generation is increasingly normalized. By the third generation, if there's not a turnaround, then the society would collapse either internally or by being so weakened that they're able to be taken over externally. Anyway, so that was sort of a fascinating thing, that this is what we've introduced real wounds through this, all that we've been talking about, and that was by design. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but their literature time and again, Marx would write about abolish the family. And we even hear, I read in some of my research, found contemporary thinkers who are pretty unabashedly saying this as well. And I think it's hard to believe because it just sounds so bizarre, but it really has been a goal. And I think that they realize that the things that kept the state from achieving its power were the authorities of God, the authority of family. It's really hard when you have a good family to deny, the goodness of that life and the life, and it connects you to a relationship with God. But once that is corrupted, men become weak because they lose their moral authority because they're tomcatting or licentious. Women become distrustful. They become wounded and unable to trust men, and children become rebellious. They see you quickly become cynical because you see these betrayals by the people who you're most supposed to trust. Anyway, so that's the first avenue of indoctrination. The second is...
Can I pause for just a second?
Yeah.
Sorry. So maybe 2 things. It's right. Like Engels, I remember, I think Engels quotes Robert Owen or something saying like the 3 obstacles to socialist reform are private property, religion, and this present form of marriage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think actually that's what, but just quickly, just for listeners, what you say, it sounds conspiratorial, but you read you read very clear things. Could you just give 1 or 2 quick examples of say contemporary things, any thinker who's just makes it very clear that's what the goal is.
Well, I mean, that was contained in they deleted it, but the Black Lives Matter What We Believe page. I remember early on there was a big hubbub about it, and it was hard to believe, but they had said they had their statements of what they wanted, and what it was about queering the culture. They wanted to just disrupt any understanding of sort of heteronormativity, that heterosexuality is a norm, not even ethically speaking, but just that it is the default way to be. Mm-hmm. And then they wanted to disrupt the traditional Western nuclear family. I have another anecdote in the book. A woman, she's an academic, and she was writing for, I won't remember the periodical, but she's writing about education, and then she just kind of goes off on the screed about how we all know that the family is the enemy of our progress, both in our academic institutions, but as a culture, and that the quicker we can change our understanding of the necessity of family life and broaden it to almost become meaningless, the closer we'll be to real progress. So I can't remember what chapter that's in, but I have that in there too. Right. So
okay, that's good. Yeah, I think it's just because I think, as you said, it sounds like a conspiracy, but if you read it, it's pretty clear. That's and I mean, Marcuse and Adorno, I think it was Adorno, says something like, "Why should any man take responsibility for taking care of a woman he once slept with," or something. Right. Like, vulgar. It's quite vulgar,
right.
And low, but right. So that just seems to encourage bad men.
Right. Well, and there's all that stuff. Mark read, one of the former weathermen. Paul Kengor writes about this in his book Takedown, which is a great book. That they in part of the revolution was so clearly understood to be sexual that there's this woman took them in as when they were sort of on the lam, and when her husband went to work, they both slept with her, and they said, this is part of your liberation, is that you're in this bourgeois marriage, even though you have radical ideas, you need to actually live out a sexuality of revolution. And that means you have to have sex with various men. You have to be able to be, engage in same-sex acts, even if you're not inclined towards that. That disinclination towards homosexuality is part of your interior repression too. And so they would kind of force themselves to do things like that, even beyond what they desired. And that was considered a revolutionary act. So, yeah.
Del Noce kind of talks about this in his critique of the move from how sexual liberation is part of the kind of the Marxist movement in Italy in the 20th century. But okay, so the second indoctrination is thought and speech control.
Yeah. So in that chapter, I talk about the move from critical thinking to critical theory, which has obviously been such a huge thing, and the dominance that critical theory has, and that. There's this really interesting thing that happens that I didn't understand. I feel like people oftentimes will say, "Why is tolerance only seems to go in one way?" That there seems to be sort of a disparity in direction of tolerance. For example, you don't tolerate traditional understandings of marriage or whatever in mainstream channels, but that really comes from. Part of this indoctrination process is what Marcuse called repressive tolerance, that there's a dominant group, and that group should not get equal airtime. There's no value of free speech. We don't want to dialogue with these people. We need to reverse the domination structure. So we need to dominate them. So repressive tolerance would be understanding what should be tolerated and what should be canceled or quieted or rejected utterly, because the goal is not to seek the truth. The goal is to change the structure of society and to become an activist. So, and that's why, in the third chapter in Indoctrination, I call it education activism, because it really was this radical shift from understanding our education to be for the sake of coming to the truth and developing ourselves as critical thinkers, but rather to churn out activists. And this is super well documented, that the goal now is to raise our consciousness to see our oppression in order that we might become activists for the sake of ultimately a revolution. And that's been really crippling.
And you do document that. I think we're doing it quickly here on the podcast, but you do go through and you give examples from, Dewey to his influence at the Teachers College in Columbia, who Marcuse I saw influencing there, and a number of contemporary educators, right? It gives some resources there in your book for that.
Right. And all that was shocking for me in my research, because it does. I know when I'm saying it now quickly, it just sounds so bizarre, but it's there. It's all there to read. It's just a matter of seeing it and reading it. But
maybe one important example, or somebody that we should be thinking of or paying attention to.
Well, I think the national education and the NEA. Sorry, I'm blanking on the acronym, but they list as recently as I think 2 years ago listed abortion rights as part of their goals as academic institution. Even in Los Angeles, there was a hubbub about the teachers union was saying that in order to open up schools again because of COVID, that one of their requirements was defunding the police. They just have become such a political machine. And there's wonderful teachers. This is obviously not to disparage it totally, but there did become this real activist element, and we see that with like you were saying, the Teachers College, that the lever, they understood pretty early on that if you can train teachers who will go out into different districts and then go train people on themselves, you are going to have this exponential spread of the ideology, and that would be the way to transform the country, is through the academy in that way.
Right. So it's a malformation in the say it's an indoctrination or it's like propagandizing, so that formation, education is traditionally understood as a formation in the truth. It becomes propaganda for ideological purposes. Yeah. So let's just go kind of briefly to the 2 chapters right at the beginning of The Origin, where you have the road to Frankfurt and coming to America.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll conclude with restoration and this kind of religious aspect.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't you maybe go over the Frankfurt School and what some of their ideas are. Now that we've kind of learned about where it's going, give us some of the sources.
Sure. Well, and we've touched upon some of this already in this conversation, which is great. But the Frankfurt School was started in Germany. They were trying to analyze why the revolution had not come about. They were frustrated. And Freud had become a big influence for many of the instrumental people in that institute. And they came to America, ultimately got welcomed into Columbia as sort of an adjunct institution. And they decided.
And the New School, didn't they go to the New School? Didn't they found the New School for Social Research, or is that different?
The Institute for Social Research, yeah.
Yeah.
So what they did in building on Gramsci is they basically said that the oppression, the bourgeois and the proletariat, these categories need to be broadened to gender. That the father, and this is already in seeds in earlier writings, obviously, but the father is the oppressor. Parents are oppressors. Children are proletariats in that dynamic, but also that there is oppression to be found almost endlessly in all other aspects of Western civilization. And this would be a way to get further and further fractionate groups that would agitate for change and then ultimately unite kind of as this aggregate of proletariat groups or oppressed groups that would ultimately overthrow the West. So they had very specific aims. They really wanted to figure out a way to overthrow the Western civilization. And, it was early on, they realized that there was one architect in the Frankfurt School, William Reich, and he was called the father of the sexual revolution. He actually wrote a piece called The Sexual Revolution. And he was adamant about early sex ed for the sake of seeding into the imaginations of children things that would be contradictory to sort of a bourgeois family value, and putting into their imagination sexual desires, sexual images. And that in that way, you could really start seeding something of a revolutionary spirit into the next generation. So they had that. Critical theory originates here. Adorno went to Hollywood, and that's when he really realized the power. First, they were repulsed by the culture of Hollywood, but then they really realized there was this real power there. And so one of the main things that he would write about was that we have to all art should be for the sake of change, for the sake of activism. It's not to reflect beauty. Like It's a Wonderful Life would be a ridiculous piece of art for them, or a movie for them. But rather, all movies, all art should be showing people, revealing to them their misery, even to a way beyond what's reflective of reality. So you want to exaggerate the narrative, in fact, because an exaggeration will get them more agitated. And, as Solinsky would say, rub raw the sores of discontent. So you need it. It really relies on a populace that is grieved, resentful, angry. This is the goal for the sake of creating change. So that was the Frankfurt School, and they became hugely influential, as we were just talking about with education system. Marcuse mentored, several of the people in the Weather Underground, and Angela Davis was a protege of his. This didn't disappear in the 60s. It became institutionalized in some ways, that a lot, Foucault and all these, the postmodernism became, it sort of nested into critical theory, and it really became like a powder keg, like the combination of postmodernism with critical theory created this real meaninglessness. And by deconstructing everything down, that they're eliminating narratives from our lives, really takes meaning out, right? And so, I'm not sure how much more history we should go into, but that.
No, that's good. I mean, I think that's good. I mean, I think it explains. I mean, you do have a lot more in the book, but I mean, it explains that these ideas developed over time. And so, again, like I quoted Keynes, like it's like the attitudes of some, the scribblings of some defunct economist, and like my line to the students, like Nietzsche knows who you are. Mm-hmm. That what Lewis had this point where he talks about something like with relativism. It used to be kind of the luxury of the upper certain parts of the intellectual classes, and then it became dominant. And I give a talk on the effects of relativism, right, of what it does. And this is what we're seeing with young people in the colleges and on the streets and in the conversations, is watered down, absorbed Frankfurt School Marxist Gramsci. I mean, this stuff is Freud. It's all kind of popularized and watered down. And so some people know what they're saying, and other people are just kind of parroting some idea that they have no idea of the origin of. Right. And I think, again, that's why I like your book. It brings the origin. So let's maybe conclude with the first chapter and the last two, which is the first chapter is called "Ye Shall Be Gods," and the last two are part of part 4, the restoration to the person and the family, and then the last three, the person, the family, and the city of God. You start out within a sense going right into religion, right? Mm-hmm. Meaning you looked at like Leon Kass's book on the beginning of wisdom, and I think that his discussion. I don't know if you touched this in your book, but he just talks about the Tower of Babel. Yeah. It's a new Tower of Babel movement. There's this desire. I mean, I talk about this sometimes in different contexts, but that, if you look at say Adam and Eve, and you look at the sin, there's a delight with the beautiful earth, right? And we want the delight. And then there's a desire to be God. And so in one sense, we're delighted by pleasure, but there's also this move of, if we want to go further, that our temptations as human beings are to either live like animals, right, raw exercise of our will for pleasure seeking, or to become like a god, where we're going to create the technical solution to the problems of evil, sin, suffering, and death. And in a sense, I think what you're articulating in this development is it is also a religious movement, as it were, right? Could you develop a little bit of that and then talk about the restoration and what you think is the alternative to this?
Sure. Yeah. No. In the first chapter, the history really starts before Hegel and Marx. It really starts in the garden, right? Promise that you shall be as gods. And I think we see that in all three of the distortions. If we elevate our will over our bodies and reason and nature, we are placing ourselves as the ultimate authority. If we human power elevated over authorities is an attempt to make ourselves gods. The most fascinating way that I think that we do this is I explore in the last chapter, the Girard chapter, the last part of the dogma section, which is that there's something really fascinating to me about the fact that this is a movement that encourages us to want to become God. God is the perfect innocent victim. So they've got the victim thing, right? That you kind of become powerful by being a victim. You can't quite grasp his innocence, right? I mean, it's possible. We can't grasp his innocence. So they turn innocence into dominance, which means that you can only achieve innocence by pointing out the worstness of the other, and you get some sort of relative absorption. You absorb sort of an innocence there. But there are all these connections between,
and then you scapegoat, right?
You scapegoat, yeah. But it has all these horrible ramifications, which is that children have to be stripped of their innocence because their innocence is actually a threat to the movement, and that was one of the most fascinating things to really dig into in the book for me. But and even the innocence of women, but. So it has this way in which it's mimicking Christianity in particular, but it's doing so by developing its own sort of untenable premises that ultimately make it far more akin to a cult than it is to a religion. And I go through sort of the cult-like aspects at one point, which are unquestionable dogmas, a justification of bad behavior for some, but not for others. There's sort of a blamelessness for certain people. Sort of a zero-sum kind of bad guys, good guys. It's almost like what you see in like a fundy kind of culture. Intolerance of questioning or dialogue. That wouldn't be tolerated anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's what like Voegelin and Del Noce talk about, like the suppression of questions.
Yeah.
The zero-sum model. Yeah.
And it makes sense because ultimately I think what it comes down to is that this is an ideology built on a lie, and a lie is threatened by a question, right? A lie has to be unassailable because it's ultimately a house of cards. Like if you really are confident in the coherence of your worldview, you welcome questions, right? I mean, I think that's why Catholics traditionally love philosophy because we want to be challenged. We want to hear the other side. We want to, we're not scared of the truth because we think we found it. And so it's not a threat. A question is not a threat. But if you deep down know that this is something built on a lie, then a question can really kill it.
Right. Yeah, that's what, I think one is like, that's also like the tradition, the Talmudic study, right? There's constant study and debate, right? In the Jewish tradition, because you're wrestling with these things, which is, of course, that's where Catholic tradition comes from. But I think also like, I talk about this with Carlo Lancialotti and Del Noce, which I keep bringing up, but I mean, he's really analyzing Marxism in the 20th century. And so he's kind of like a prequel to some of the things you're doing. But, that he and Voegelin talk about the suppression of questions, right? And at the end, like you have to continue to ask questions. And those questions have to be seeking truth. They're not simply a destructive, but they're always like that. It's what I would say the philosophical project, which is the opposite of the ideological project. So it's interesting because we can't get into this, but there is part of what is called cancel culture, which is very much part of this ideological kind of group that you're dealing with, grouping of ideas. And it's interesting because cancel culture relates to this point that Voegelin says, like, what does Marx say? That's not a question for socialist man. Like you just can't even ask that question, right? And that I think too is just a sign of the pseudo-religious ideological nature is the suppression of questions and what I think is interesting that you go through that cult-like element. But anyway, keep going then. So
well, that's why it becomes such a slogans become so important, right? That whenever an ideology relies on slogans, as does a cult, because it keeps you from thinking deeply. You just sort of hang your hat on these sort of superficial truisms, or and that you're taught, and it keeps you buffered from deep reflection, serious questioning. And it's amazing how much we can buffer ourselves because it's hard work to do the real honest process of thinking and questioning.
All right. Okay, so I have two questions before I let you go, and I am grateful. One is, this is perfect time. I had it in my notes to ask you, so I'll ask it now. What would you say, like we're critiquing the woke ideology, but we have to critique ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm a critic of the woke. What it's called woke. I mean, it's that's a kind of a popular term, but this kind of like neo-Marxist oppression vision of reality.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a critic of. I think it's erroneous. But what do we need to be self-critical? And maybe this will lead us into restoration.
Mm-hmm.
We have to make sure that we don't respond to ideology with ideology.
Right.
Propaganda is not defeated by propaganda. It's defeated by truth. And we, like you and I, agree on these things. So this is right. But we have errors and blind spots.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything you learned?
Well, I mean, that actually goes right into the restoration part. The first restoration chapter is the restoration of the person, which I think is all about self-knowledge. And how do you actually see yourself honestly? I think there's a few different ways. One is, dialogue. That's why the suppression of speech is such a detriment to the health of a society, because dialogue literally means dual logos. It's the communication of thoughts and ideas, but you have to communicate it, right? Jordan Peterson talks about this somewhere, that writing is great and thinking is great, but it's actually in the moment communication, dialogue with another human being, where you're tested, you're pushed, things are pushed back against you. You have to examine, you have to rethink, you have to you can't just curate all of your thoughts in a sort of very particular solitary way. Dialogue, critical thinking. As a Catholic, I find confession to be a completely game-changing. If someone can get to weekly confession, I just think that's a total transformation of your life, because it forces you. We want to look outside of ourselves for why things are going wrong. And it's not until we look interiorly and really start understanding the nuances of where our struggle lies and where we are sort of having these subtle failures of generosity, or are letting our ego take control. These are subtle things to figure out. And the life of the Catholic, I think, is for a long time like, how can I avoid mortal sin? And then it's, well, how can I avoid more of my mortal sins? And then, okay, I'm kind of making a habit of not doing this, but eventually the spiritual life becomes so much more freeing and particular, and also just delicate, where you really are trying to actually grow in this really specific way. Anyway, so that gets into.
Well, that's just the examination of conscience is important, and I need to do it better. But I sometimes don't tell the liturgists, and I'm going to tell you. But sometimes with the children, especially when they're younger, I probably should have with my younger ones now. We'd do our evening prayer, and I would have a little joy. I'd say, so I confess to Almighty God, to you, my brothers and sisters, that I have greatly sinned. Right. And I said, was it Mama's fault? No. Was it Daddy's fault? No. How about it was President Obama? Was it President Obama's fault? Okay. How about, President Trump? Whose fault? Was it my teacher's fault? Like, no. I would have kind of a joke with them, and they would laugh, right? Yeah. Because the next slide, of course, is my fault. My fault, my most grievous fault. Right. And there's something that's really beautiful. It's in Psalm 51, depending on the counting, which is the Psalm of David, which is, create a clean heart in me, O Lord, the very famous one of his repentance. But one of my favorite lines in it really strikes me is, for God loves truth in the heart. Mm. Right? God loves truth in the heart. And to have truth in the heart is really hard. I mean, I'm not saying I do. I'm just saying that I think that goes to your point, is to strive for that truth in the heart. Yeah. Is really hard.
Well, and that's the most interesting thing, is that the church is not having us do examinations of conscience or go to confession arbitrarily as some weird spiritual direction. It's directly tied to the nature of what we are and how we are going to do well in life, and you see this just on a practical level too. I remember years ago listening to Ben Carson. He was talking about he grew up with a single mom, very extreme poverty, and she used to repeat this poem to him called Mr. Nobody. And it'd be, when something goes wrong, who do I have to blame? It's Mr. Nobody. And it spoke to what you're talking about, just this human instinct to want to blame someone, and how ultimately that you have to start with yourself and what you can control. And he went on to become a heart surgeon and this flourishing person, but on a practical level, we know in success leadership, training that, in business, we know over and over again in secular circumstances these lessons that we have to, that blaming, passing the buck is not going to make you successful. But for some reason, this ideology, we abandon it utterly and treat people to orient themselves to blaming things outside of themselves. And it's ultimately why I wanted to write the book, is because it just seems so apparent that this is not going to help them. This is harming people. And it's
right. It doesn't. It's not charity.
Yeah, it's not real love.
It's not just.
Right.
It's not just.
Right.
It's unjust to tell someone, oh yeah, you're in a disordered life right now. That's okay.
Yeah,
like it's unjust. And I've actually talking to someone about this. Oftentimes, sexual disorder comes from abuse.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And actually, this priest he was explaining this. Talk to me. So I want to give him credit for it. But he said, oftentimes for abuse, when you say, well, it's okay, that's your identity, you're actually saying, oh, yeah, it doesn't matter that you were abused. That injustice that had taken place, right? Because there's wounds that take place. This goes to your point. When someone has been wounded, to say, well, now that's your identity because you were wounded, is actually unjust. It's not loving. It doesn't take the reality of the situation into account. And the reason I think to bring it up this way is because it can often, this discussion is, this is not a politically correct discussion. It can sound harsh and everything, but I think that's why I like about your book, and there's something that, I think we have to cultivate, is that we have to treat each person, right, as a unique, unrepeatable creature who's been created by God with a will. Mm-hmm. And then you actually address this, like that the classic thing, you hate the sin, you love the sinner. Mm-hmm. And that's what we have to do in ourselves. Mm-hmm. Right, is we hate the sin in ourselves, but we also are called to love ourselves, right? Because we love our neighbor like ourselves. And I think this idea that to speak the truth in love, mm-hmm. and to have, and this goes to your part in restoration, being in relationship with the family and with others gives you the ability to be told the truth in a loving way. Yeah. Yes, families can be problem. Yes, we all make mistakes. You're a mother of 6, and I know you're not perfect, right? Neither is your husband, and I am. My wife is excellent, but my poor children, right? They have to put up with me. But in a sense, though, you talk about that family is the family is the place where culture gets passed down, but it's also the place where human flourishing and mistakes can be. You can grow in love, right? And there has to be truth telling, and so it's not. I think that's the other thing. It's like it's an alternative. We're not. I don't think you're saying injustice isn't real, right? It's that yes, injustice is real, but this is the absolutely wrong. It's precisely the wrong direction to go to deal with injustice. Yeah. What do you say?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it comes down to being known. That's part of living in the truth, right? Is that to live a truthful life, you have to really understand where your struggle lies and have that experience with other people. And that's what everyone wants, right? Everyone wants real intimacy. Mm-hmm. Everyone wants that, whether you're no matter what side of any partisan discussion you're on, like right. Every person desires the same things. So we just disagree about how to get there. And I think that the more that we can have this discussion with this full honesty is, utterly crucial, because it seems to me like people have been sold a bill of goods, and this is harming them. It's separating people. The root word devil is to separate. And, so clearly seems to be fracturing us down into these warring tribes where we're all prone to tribalism, whether you're Catholic, Christian, Jewish, secular, anyone can be prone to sort of make an ism out of a tribe and a group identity, or to be motivated by grievances. But the ideas that animate the Judeo-Christian worldview are correctives for that instinct, whereas the ideas that animate the woke movement are actually encouraging that. So though people can look and behave in the same poor ways, there are certain ideas that can exacerbate them, and there are certain ideas that can help correct that. And so that's sort of what I wanted to drill into. It's not to say that this group of people are bad or these group of people are better. It's more just what are your operating principles here, and are those helping?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's great. And I like at the end, you say, and I'll put it in the context of what you're talking about. You say, in many ways, it's an old tale, right? In his Imaginings of Hell, you say, Dante reserves some of the lowest levels for bishops and priests. Mm-hmm. So what does St. John Eudes said? The road to hell is paved with the skull of bishops, right? So I'm glad I'm not one, because it's a hard job. Yeah. But he said the church has always been a battleground for all people at all stages of the spiritual life, from St. Francis to Oscar Wilde, from Chris Foley to Andy Warhol. All creatures, saints and sinners, struggling, resisting, revolting, and returning over and over until their last breath. And you say that this horizon of eternity stretches before us, right? I think it goes back to your point, like we desire to be known. And where you're known is in deep, loving relationships, primarily the family, but also then all the things that extend from that. And of course, the church, you and I are Catholic, so we think it's a church as well. But let me ask you this, just one last question, just because I think at the end we've talked about this is a way to see the person. And I think you don't make this case like you should become Catholic. Right. I mean, that's not the end of your book. So let me ask you this question. Some people may listen to this if they've gotten this far and say, they just like disagree with you, they disagree with me. But back to this kind of question of like, maybe a woman may say, well, you're just talking to this, man who's the host of this podcast, and he's happy to say this because you basically affirm his patriarchy, right? And that you're not taking serious this thing, and you're kind of the term is the useful idiot, right? You're just that's the term that was given, with socialism and Marxism, that you're just kind of part of this problem. What would you say to that? What would you say to that critique that you're not taking seriously the problems of race and injustice, but specifically the wounds of women seriously enough?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. And certainly getting married and becoming Catholic and having a bunch of kids, these are not automatic pills that are going to turn everyone into like lovely, beautiful, generous people. There's certainly a real, it's a stereotype, but it's in some ways well earned of kind of like this. In movies, we see this archetype of like a domineering man who's very traditional and the submissive wife, and everyone's miserable. Right. But I think in reality that comes from it could be wounded people who don't know how to have true intimacy, but a life truly intimately led is a life that is going to understand that our goal is not power, it's actually love. And so you try to do that in the day-to-day, in the true intimacy of living with another human being who's faulty, and you've got your faults, and you've got these children, all of a sudden things are busy and overwhelming. And, this is a process in truly striving towards intimate understanding of the other person and understanding your goal not to be power, but actually love and service. You're going to learn so much about yourself. And if both people are doing that caricature of that oppressive man is anyone who's actually striving to live a life of a real family life with all of the messy particulars and striving to do it with service is going to no more recognize that as their goal than they're going to recognize like a abandoning father or something, like the goal is a servant leadership. So, Adam comes home from work and he pulls up at the house and he says, all right, this is where my day begins. I wrote about this in the first Theology of Home book. He orients himself to understand that his work is for the sake of our mutual project, which is the home life and the family, and that this is where the rubber meets the road, and he has to bring his best efforts to this life that we're living here as a joint project, with the good of each other at the forefront of our minds. So, the hollowing out of the man's understanding of the importance and dignity of the family life really led to a hollowing out of the woman's understanding, and then it trivialized her mission. Anyway, so these are big other topics, and maybe it's a tangent, but I guess I would just say that, I understand where that impulse is coming from, to think that maybe I'm a useful idiot, and maybe, I want to check myself and make sure, but by experience is that the life it feels like the real road to happiness and the real road to joy. And I think we all understand that when we cling tightly to our egos and to our power, we really end up in fear of losing it. And a life sort of surrendered to providential God and striving to live a life of service, that we all know, whether you're religious or not, that is actually going to make you happier. I think people know that. If it doesn't take religion to really teach you that pursuing your ego projects is going to make you miserable. I think people really will admit that if you talk to them. So what I'm saying is just an extension of that.
Well, maybe that's good. Yeah, thank you for that. And then maybe we just end with this. I think the restoration project that you give is more detailed. You have those 3 chapters on the family and the person and the city of God is what you call the 3rd chapter. But you've articulated this before, but I think this is the in a sense, the summary. The summary is actually being known, right? It's really it's an affirmation of the person who is in relationship with other people and in that real, authentic relationship. It's not person over group, but it's the person in a group and a person who is known and respected as a person. That seems to be it sounds trite, but that seems to be your, in a way, to summarize, that's the alternative to the misery of kind of seeing everything in a master-slave relationship. It's actually to enter into an intersubjective personal relationship of mutual love. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. And that, if the problem is that the person is reduced in the ideology, this is the antidote to that, right? This is the recognizing the fullness of the person. And I think you're right on when you say it sounds sort of trite, but it's because sometimes the thing that's most simple is the thing that's most profound, the thing right in front of our noses. So,
and hard to do.
Yeah, and hard to do. It's simple, but not easy, right?
Yeah. Good. Well, Noelle, thank you very much. Thanks for a lot of time. It was a long time to talk about your book. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're busy with the 6 children and all the work that you have to do. So appreciate your time. And I will put some links up to Theology of Home. And the book is not out yet, but I'll put links for pre-ordering. And I hope that we can have you back and talk about more philosophy.
It was so fun to talk to you, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.